but give it a try. Welcome back, everyone, to The Global Gambit, a podcast that looks at the relationship of geopolitics, economics, international relations, and right now the war in Iran. The situation over the Strait of Hormuz is escalating, and we had a fascinating chat with one expert about what they think could be happening. But now we're going to have an equally fascinating conversation with someone else who may well have some similar views or some different views. But I'm very delighted to be hosting Professor Glenn Diesen of the Glenn Diesen channel and the Greater Eurasia podcast. Glenn, it's lovely to meet you. I hope to do many of the more of these going forward. But you know, right now we've seen the war sort of subside, pause, but the talks, unsurprisingly, perhaps didn't go anywhere. And now Trump is going to try to close the entire Strait of Hormuz with a naval blockade. How are you looking at this right now?
Yeah, no, I would have thought that the United States would have put in greater efforts to put an end to this thing, because it is a disaster. There's a reason why the U.S. Wanted some talks, because they're looking at defeat. I think it's horrible in every possible way. It's militarily they're exhausting their missiles, their interceptor missiles. Economically, you see the whole global economy taking a massive hit, and of course politically as well, especially not just because this war is immensely unpopular within the US, but it also risks threatening the relationship between Israel and the United States. So it's been a terrible war on a lot of levels. So so I thought the Americans would want to put an end to it, but now that we see they essentially walked away from the negotiations in Islamabad in Pakistan, and it looks like they might continue with this war. Exactly what to do next is unclear. I don't see any great prospects for boots on the ground. But as you said, it appears now that they want to blockade Iran's blockade, because Iran essentially wants to set up a toll, so where it has selective access. So the Americans want to deny this, so they're going to block everything. This is the idea. So, which has some advantages, but a whole set of new challenges, I guess.
Yeah, there was a funny post I saw on X just before we started chatting, which was a toll within a toll. And someone's just drawn like a line of where the Iranian toll will be in the middle of the Strait of Hormuz, and then slightly further out there's an American toll as well. So it's like they want to try and constrain what the Iranians have already been doing. But one of the things that we were chatting about in a previous conversation I had with a guest was that when describing this, it seems to be very much, Iran as a collective, the team that went to Islamabad and the system as a whole versus the decision making of the United States, which is just a single entity, right? It just comes back to how Trump's feeling that day. How much do you think that influences the balance of power between the two and how they read each other?
Well, I think
Did you?
Sorry,
I lost you for a second.
Yeah, sorry, it froze a bit. Well, first of all, there's distrust. That is that the Iranians, they signed, this nuclear deal, the JCPOA, and then the Americans walked away from it. Then they had negotiations. They had a surprise attack. Then they have a second negotiation. They have a second surprise attack and a second war. And now I think it's limited what they expected from these negotiations. But also the people have been meeting, like Witkoff and Kushner, they seem more to represent Israel and the Israeli interest and American interest. So, I think Trump also, his diplomatic team, I mean, his reliance on the State Department is just, well, there is no reliance on State Department. It's quite terrible. And his diplomatic team is all his buddies, essentially. He forms a little clique of the people he trusts. I can understand this, because in his first administration, you had, the intelligence agencies and the media, everyone, undermining him with this Russiagate conspiracy theory. So I understand why he doesn't trust all the blob or the deep state, whatever one might call it. But the alternative is just putting together this ragtag team of real estate agents and family members. It's not a very serious approach to very important diplomacy. And
Do you
also,
think?
the idea
Do you,
that Kushner and Witkoff can just, before lunch they negotiate with the Russians how to end the Ukraine war. After lunch they go to meet the Iranians to finish this war. I mean, it's ludicrous. This is not how diplomacy works. There's a lot of work that has to be put into this, and I just don't see any of it being seriously done. And it's all bluster, massive threats. In the morning they will wipe out a civilization. In the evening there's applauding the brave Iranian people for making a decision. It's just they're a bit all over the place, I think.
Yeah, in another conversation, I was suggesting the idea you have in game theory, obviously, prisoner's dilemma or brinkmanship, right? The game of chicken. Do you think that that's most applicable in this case? Neither side wants to back down, and so they're both trying to use escalation as leverage, or do you think that's mainly just on the US side and the Iranians are simply reacting?
Well, I'm not sure if it would be prisoner's dilemma. I think it's more they're all in a game of all or nothing. So probably game of chicken is more appropriate. And in the game of chicken, you want to signal clearly to the adversary that you're not going to swirl, that you're just going to go straight ahead. Because then essentially if you just convince your opponent you're just going to continue to go up the escalation ladder, then they only left with two options: either go straight ahead and essentially go into mutual destruction, or swirl away and be humiliated. But that's the only options that are left. If you leave any doubt with the other side that you might yield, then they will just be incentivized to push harder. So I think, probably game of chicken would be the ideal way of describing it. But the Iranians, though, they've been quite careful about, careful maybe is the wrong word. They've been quite strategic in how they approach the escalation. That is, every time the US goes up the escalation ladder, the Iranians follow them. But they don't go too far beyond what the Americans have done, because then there's no incentive for the Americans to hold back. So, for example, they haven't destroyed all the desalination plants across the Gulf states, which would then render the whole region just a big desert, and they would have to evacuate millions of people. But instead, you see them, they're not afraid to hit these things, the energy fields and all, but they're waiting for the Americans to do it first, because this way, the Americans know very well that if they go up the escalation ladder, there will be a response. If you go immediately to the top, then there's no incentive for the Americans to restrain themselves. So in this sense, the Iranians have been very predictable. And this is also an ideal strategy if you want to ensure deterrence, because the only reason why the Americans don't escalate, for example, carpet bomb Karg Island, is because then the same would be done to the Gulf states. So I think this is the approach the Iranians have. For the Americans, I think they're in a different spot, because the Iranians, they just have to hold in there because and stick it out, because at some point the Americans will exhaust themselves. But for the United States, they're under greater pressure because time is not on their side. The longer this drags out, the more unpopular at home, the more the economy will suffer, and there's limits to the military assets they can send to the region. So for the Americans, they're under greater pressure to get a quick end to this. So they're always under this great incentive to escalate a lot. So this is essentially the language of Trump. I mean, he, will wipe you out unless you make a deal. So you always do this massive pressure, and then you leave them an out. They did the same with the Russians, by the way. They did this big countdown. We're going to bring hell on the Russians with all this crippling sanctions, all this stuff. He began a countdown with 50 days, then he just reduced it to 12 days. And then suddenly when the clock ran out, they decided to meet in Alaska. So there was, so they did something here as well. We're going to wipe you out. Your whole civilization will die. You have 10 days. And then when the clock runs out, then, okay, let's meet in Islamabad for talks. So this kind of maximum pressure usually is part of his negotiation tactic. The problem is when you face a country like Iran, or Russia for that sake, which consider themselves to be facing an existential threat. They can't really give anything. I mean, what exactly is Iran going to give the Americans here? whatever they give them, let's say they accept reducing the length the quality or the quantity of their ballistic missiles or their drone capabilities or their regional partnerships, they will leave themselves more vulnerable. And they know that the Americans and Israelis, they have an objective, that is the destruction of Israel, now of Iran. I think the regime change and essentially turn Iran into another Syria. And I think for this reason, whatever the Americans want, it will only reduce the deterrence of Iran. So for Iran, this is an existential threat. Anything they give to the Americans, they will simply leave themselves more vulnerable when the US and Israel comes back, because it doesn't seem like they're prepared to live in peace together. So I think this is the flaw in this maximum pressure. There's nothing they can give. I think the same applies for the Russians, by the way. This limits what they can give as well, because they see this also being an existential threat.
I mean, it's just insanity. Trump has alluded to the idea that he just sees what he can do in the Strait of Hormuz is the same with Venezuela, which is just like, you can do a snatch and grab operation against a country that is one of the oldest civilizations in the world, entirely built on the idea that it would expect such a situation that we've had over the past 6-7 weeks, right? This is what the Iranians have been preparing for so long. But the other thing that I'm kind of interested on is, for you and your perspective, is the third parties here, because what are the United States going to do if the Chinese are traversing, right? There's a Chinese tanker, the United States literally going to seize a Chinese tanker. Well, that's going to go down well with Beijing and DC at each other's throats. I mean, President Xi Jinping and Trump are meant to be meeting in a month. I'm not sure that's going to happen. So how do you think other parties like the Chinese or the Russians are looking at this?
Well, first, let me say that I think what you mentioned about Venezuela is quite important, because I also spoke recently with Joe Kent, which was a counterterrorism head of Trump director, and he was also making this point that I think that that the success, if you will, in Venezuela, it created some hubris. So, and you saw this in the tweets coming out from people like Lindsey Graham. I'm not sure if Trump as well insinuated the same, that now the mullahs really should pay attention to what happened in Venezuela. Iran could be next. And I thought it was a very strange comparison, because how exactly would this conflict be comparable to that one? There was zero chance that the United States would be able to fly in some helicopters, just snatch the leader, fly out, put him on some trial in New York. I mean, the whole thing seemed absurd. So I don't understand how, these are two very different conflicts. Iran is a country of more than 90 million people. The geography makes it more or less a fortress. They prepared for 30 years. They're an important piece in this on the Eurasian continent. So none of this made sense. But on that last note, their position in the Eurasian continent, I think this is also why the Iranians and the Russians would react very differently. And they are reacting very differently. I mean, people say, oh, look at the Russians and Chinese, they didn't help their friends in Venezuela. Well, great power politics do mean something. And Venezuela, it's not like the Russians or Chinese accept this is an exclusive sphere of American influence. They also have trading partners there. But there are unspoken rules. The Russians and Chinese aren't going to send in air defenses and heavy weaponry into America's backyard. That's just crazy. So this is how you start World War III. But in Iran, this is very far away from American borders, and this is a key component of the greater Eurasian partnership, that is for this integration of the economies in Eurasia, for China's east-west corridor. Iran is a key partner there. For Russia north-south corridor, the Russia, Iran, India is also important. It's a very important piece. So, and if the United States will be able to essentially make it into another Libya or Syria or Afghanistan or Iraq is just a broken, dysfunctional country, it will be a disaster for them. So they're not going to let Iran fail. So I'm assuming that they're helping in different ways. They're sending weapons. They're sending, they're offering intelligence, all of these things. But if if the Chinese are sending weapons by ship, or the Americans, or trading oil, and the Americans are now putting a blockade trying to stop the Chinese ships, I mean, I think, yeah, this is a disaster. This is how World War III might start. So, but there is a concern about this, because historically, hegemons have attempted to control international maritime corridors. They've always done so. This has been a key. This has always been why the hegemon can rely more on international trade, because they control the waterways, and they can also have a military advantage by moving troops easier. And under the past decades, it's been the United States which have been controlling most of these. Now it's beginning to be contested, as you have a declining hegemon that is of the United States. It's not going to be committed anymore to having these open corridors. So you see already the blockade on Venezuela, on Cuba. There's over the years, there's also been hijacking of these Iranian tankers every now and then. Now you have this piracy against the Russian ships, and now, of course, they might put a blockade on the Strait of Hormuz. If they're going to go after the Chinese, they might put a blockade on the Strait of Malacca. So a lot of the transportation corridors will probably not be as open and reliable as they've been in the past. So we're going back to history, essentially. And this is also one of the reasons why the Russians want the Arctic corridor. This is why the Chinese are investing so much money in the Belt and Road initiative. So, when the great powers begin to distrust each other and enter conflicts, the idea of having freedom of navigation, it's simply not the case anymore.
Yeah, no, for a long time. I mean, the Brits did it in the First World War against Germany, didn't they? And any dominant power has leveraged the seas to one advantage or another. But when it comes to what's in the psyche of them, what do you think the red lines of either was or is? Because what we hear publicly may not always be the case behind closed doors. The idea of backdoor diplomacy happens a lot. And from my understanding, they have left the door open. Vance's comments made it clear that nothing had really made progress, but equally talks were still possible. It's not like they had shut down any potential of revisiting. So, is Trump going to leverage the Hormuz or attempt to, and then the Iranians will be like, and come back, or Trump's going to learn quite quickly that it's not happening, and then he's going to have to come back to the table? Or do we just go back to what we've been dealing with for the past 6-7 weeks?
Well, I don't think that's been written yet. It could go both ways. I think for the United States, the main problem was they had to put an end to this, because, as I said before, this was a disaster. So they kind of have to, they have to address reality, which is that they're looking at the possible defeat. While there's not much they can do, like militarily, what are they going to do? Because Trump can just beat his chest, say we won, and go home and have his own victory parade, whatever he wants. But as long as the Strait of Hormuz is under Iranian control, this is a defeat, and it's very obvious that it's defeat. Then the Iranians can set up a toll booth essentially to get the reparations to rebuild from the countries that attacked it. They can use it to limit the access, condition that countries trade in the oil in non-dollar currencies. So they essentially dismantle the petrodollar system that links the US to the region. They can put additional restrictions on countries that host American bases, which threatens Iran's security. So there's a lot they can do, and all of this will be a defeat for the United States. So the US can't really leave unless they open the Strait of Hormuz. But there's nothing you can do about opening the Strait of Hormuz. It's not like this one place on the coastline where the Iranians can hit them. They can hit along the entire coastline, and they don't even have to be positioned in the coastline. They can be deep inside the country. There's no way they can do this unless you do a ground invasion of all of Iran. But this isn't going to happen either. So it's very difficult to see what exactly they could do in such a situation. And also, Trump can keep saying that he killed off their Navy, their Air Force, all these things. But if you're going to shut down Strait of Hormuz, it's going to be done with fairly cheap weapons. all these drones that they're building, they don't need the massive factories for a lot of them. They have an immense industrial capacity to just ramp up production. Given that they've been fueling drone supplies for Russia for a few years now, they already have much of the infrastructure in place as well. So even if they exhaust, what they have in storage, they can make new ones as well. So it's not clear to me how the US are going to stop this fairly simple to make weapons which are cheap. On the contrary, as long as the Iranians are using drones for a few $1,000s, which the Americans have to shoot down with interceptor missiles, which cost a few millions, it's time is on Iran's side. So this is the main problem. So sorry. So to get to your questions, I think this is sorry. That was a very long introduction. I think here's the problem. Trump can't admit defeat. He's defeated, but he can't admit defeat. So maybe this is where they're going. They're just say, okay, let's start the ceasefire. We talk, but they can't admit defeat. So they can't accept what the Iranians are demanding. But they might not want to go back to a shooting war. So they'll just, keep it on the slow burner maybe, and try to extend the ceasefire, extend it, and it will be like a low intensity conflict instead. But again, it might 48 hours from now they might be hammering each other with missiles again, because the Americans don't have time on their side either, so they do have to escalate at some point to put pressure on Iran. So it's not clear to me what the plan is, which is why I thought they should have gone to a great length to put an end to this thing.
But Glenn, I thought the plan was the terms that they set out in that very notable press conference, right? A few days ago, Pete Hegseth made it very clear they knew exactly what the plans were. Oh, wait, I think they changed them about 6 times. I'm being facetious naturally, but so do you think we could just end up in like a Korea situation, an effective, 80 years worth of armistice? Because they're both technically still at war. So we never really see these two establish a peace deal. I mean, no official declaration of war was given, but these two just remain perpetually in a state of conflict, even if it's occasional rockets. Is that sort of what we could be in the Strait?
Yeah, I think so. And if that's the case, the Iranians just need to keep the capability that they can go up that escalation ladder with the Americans. So if the Americans decide to start to strike their energy fields, then they have to be able to do the same, because this has kind of been the American tactic over the years. This is a slow, low intensity conflicts, because over the years they kind of set up these informal rules of the region. That is, we might come and bomb you a little bit sometimes, and then if you don't do anything, retaliate, then we'll keep it, a light symbolic strike. But if you retaliate, then it's not going to be merely a bloody nose. Then we'll come and hit you really hard. So you see over the years since the 90s, drop a little bombs on Iraq every now and then, drop a bit of bombs on Libya, Syria. But Iran, they kind of made it clear this is not what we're not going to accept this, because they see this as a long game, that the Americans are putting these crippling sanctions, trying to fuel internal dissent, terrorist groups. And of course, if they can also start to bomb every now and then, over the long run, they can create enough economic uncertainty and societal uncertainty that the government begins to crumble, and they can look for regime change and then the destruction. So they essentially said, no, if you bomb a little bit, we're going to bomb you a lot. And this is, this is how they set it up. So it's going to be hard to do low intensity conflict, I think, given that Iran insists on asserting its deterrence. And you can understand this. If Iran said, listen, we're just going to bomb Washington, D.C. a little bit, and, don't overreact, it's not going to happen. If you bomb a little bit, if you drop a few bombs on the Congress, the Americans will react in a big way. And this is essentially what the Iranians are saying as well. You have to respect our deterrence. And that is the main game for the Iranians. But again, for the Americans, they need to crack the problem of the Strait of Hormuz. I'm not sure if blockading the blockade is what will solve it. If anything, the U.S. will now participate further in the instability of the world economy. So,
So if I can just reframe the question then, or slightly broaden it a little bit, why do we see such differing interpretations of the reality of the situation. Of course, there's propaganda, there's information warfare, but people who are heavily pro-Trump, MAGAs incarnated, will somehow try to spin this that Trump has been, let alone 4D chess, Glenn, we've got 5D chess now, of Trump. This is all part of a plan that by closing the Strait of Hormuz, Trump's now going to be forcing everybody else to pay attention and to agree to his terms. But then on the other side, people emphasize that the Iranians are simply the masters of strategy here. Like, how can we be so worlds apart? And what is the reality, in your opinion?
No, I think, the way I see it, I think the narrative from Trump is quite fraudulent, and you also get this. It also comes out very clear. I mean, in one tweet he goes, "We don't need the Strait of Hormuz. We have our own energy. This is a problem of other countries." And you give him a few hours, and then he tweets out, "You crazy bastard, you will burn in hell. Will destroy you if you don't open up the strait." So, he's a little bit like a child. He's, "No, I don't care." But then, and then obviously he does care. I mean, this is a massive problem for the United States. It's not just like I said, the toll thing isn't just putting money in the hands of Iran. Controlling seaways have always also been a source of political influence as well, and it can reshape the entire security architecture of the region. So this is a huge thing for the US, and I think it's just that reality. There's nothing the US can do about this. It's the Iranians can drop a few mines, and then the whole thing shuts down. It's impossible to keep it open, even if they get a few ships through. What happens next day? I mean, what is the point here? So no, I think they need either the full capitulation of Iran, or they need a deal. The problem now is that Iran is not, they're not going to accept American terms, because their main concern is, even if we're dying, everything's being destroyed. If we make a deal, doesn't mean peace. It just means that the US and Israel will be back in a few months when we're weaker. So I think they're just going to go all in on this, and that's why, the game of chicken might be where we end up.
I think it's the game of chicken, isn't it, in game theory? Let's talk a little bit about the idea of a demining coalition. There was news about this a couple of weeks ago, at least from the UK. There's this idea that they would be leading some demining coalition. The US and France would be part of it. Now Britain has said, I saw in the past hour, they're not going to be part of any operations in the Strait. Where does this leave Europe? Because, and I'll expand on this question a little bit more, because I would like your overall take on it, which is that Iran hasn't yet activated or incorporated assets like the Houthis, some people argue. And so if the Houthis were to close the Gulf of Aden and therefore limit access to the Suez Canal, that's obviously going to bring in Egypt, which is a non-major NATO ally. And you've obviously got NATO, quote unquote, and broader Europe. So what do you think this does if the spillover effect continues? Is Europe largely irrelevant because of its squabbling and stuff? Or in the disunited front, or do you think that if Europe gets involved, it could be a messier situation?
Well, I think the declining relevance of Europe fits in with a much wider context. I'm sorry, I know I wanted two long answers, but I think that the whole relevance of Europe is very much tied up to the transatlantic partnership, and I think this partnership is dying for not just because of Trump, but for just because of the international distribution of power. I think that in the bipolar order after World War II, we had a common enemy to balance, the Soviet Union. So this brought us together, two centers of power, two ideologies. The dividing lines were quite clear. Then in the hegemonic era, the Europeans had the ambition to essentially join in on this hegemonic or unipolar moment by having it the collective hegemony of the West standing on the legs of the US and the EU. But in the multipolar world, the world looks very different. And I even wrote a book about it 6 years ago, that I expect the US and Europe to drift apart, because in the multipolar world, the US going to have to make priorities. It can't be everywhere anymore. And what is its priorities? Well, its main rival is in East Asia, so that's a priority. It want to make sure that other great powers don't set up itself in its own backyard. So you have the Western Hemisphere, but it would seek to reduce its position in Europe and in East Asia, and in the Middle East. And to a large extent, this is what was reflected in the national security strategy in December of 25. That is, we have to get out of Europe and Middle East and focus on the Western Hemisphere and East Asia. That makes us rational for the United States. It makes a lot of sense. And it's not just Trump. I mean, it was Obama that said we have to pivot to Asia. If you pivot to somewhere, you have to pivot away from somewhere. This is the whole point. So Europe, I think this relationship is dying. But for the Europeans, they don't really know what to do, because if the Americans leave, they're a pacifier. They're great for many reasons. They make Europe relevant through the transatlantic partnership. They fulfill essentially the ideological requirements that our political leaderships have grown up with over the past 30 years, which is together the political West will elevate the role of liberal democratic values. But the third thing is obviously the pacifier issue. That is, if the Americans leave, the Europeans will begin to squabble more among themselves. Of course, it can go both ways. If the Americans leave now, while some people are saying, well, now it's the time for the Europeans to really, pool the resources to stand united. I believe more that they will turn on each other, because the interests are too different. The Greeks, the Latvians, the Irish, I mean, what do they have in common? The idea that they're all going to unite for what? Fighting Russia, attacking Iran? What is it that unites? I don't see the common interest necessarily. I think it could be geoeconomic interest, but we threw all of those away when we decided to fight this proxy war with the Russians. So I think this is why Europe is becoming less relevant, and I think this is also reflected in this conflict, because Trump, when he fails in Iran, he needs to do many things. First, you have to blame someone, so he gets to blame the Europeans and NATO for being useless, and this way he can also distance himself more from NATO, because he can't vote America out of NATO, because Washington looks very different than it does inside Trump's head. He's kind of minority voice on this so far. So I think he will seek to blame the Europeans and see this as an opportunity to reduce America's expensive footprint within Europe. So I don't see much that Europe can do. We don't have the military. We don't have the economic strength. It's weakening. We don't have the political unity. So I don't see much that Europe can do, to be honest.
That's disappointing to hear that, Glenn. I was hoping you'd be more bullish instead of bearish. No, but I mean, it's just on this point for a second then. Just could we not argue that strategic necessity is enough of a driving force to encourage Europe to unite, quote unquote, whatever that means? I think part of the problem is we don't have a clear idea of how Europe could be more united unless it becomes a federal state. Now, you could argue that Trump's actions and behavior towards Europe is pushing even the right wing, his former populist supporters or leaders of other heads like Marine Le Pen or whatever, to actually be like, maybe we should federalize. He's pushing them away and towards Europe first, in a way that I don't think anyone expected. Moreover, yes, we do have a military deficit, but we do have a $400 billion in theory size, right? And that's not with our economies in wartime footing. So, and that's a budget, potential collective budget, which is more than China and Russia together. So do you not think that there are potentials? I think it all largely depends on political capital. But do you think that because of the differences in interests between Latvia, Greece, as you mentioned, for example, or Spain, which I rightfully think closing off their usage by America, you just think that those are too systemic, that it will prohibit the Europeans from being able to work more collectively together?
Well, it didn't have to be. I think there's some strategic interest that could unite. I'm just saying, for example, in the Cold War, it was much clearer. I mean, it's two sides. It's very simple. In the unipolar moment, it was collective hegemony. It's a clear unifying idea. What is the unifying idea now? I hear from the Europeans that we have to confront Russia, but why? I think we made an enemy out of Russia unnecessarily in the 90s by expanding NATO. That was a way of cementing the American presence in Europe. That was a price we were willing to pay to some extent. But now when the Americans are leaving, what is the point? The reason I think that the geoeconomics could be the foundation of European solidarity is because independently we all stand weaker by ourselves. So if we pool our resources, have collective bargaining power essentially, the Europeans can stand more shoulder to shoulder with the Russians, the Americans, the Chinese, the Indians, and have a much stronger voice. But what is that voice saying? Because at the moment, I think states are sovereignty maximizers, is what I'm trying to say. If you want countries to pool their sovereignty, they have to get something back in return. In the 90s, they essentially said, okay, hand over some decision-making power to Brussels, and in return, we'll deliver a better trade deal. You have better governance, you have more stable neighborhood, you have more security. What are they saying now? Pool your sovereignty and, we'll burn down the Middle East, we'll open up migration, we'll fight a proxy war with the Russians, we'll cut ourselves off from energy resources, we'll deindustrialize. It's just there has to be something that they deliver, something tangible to the members. I just don't see what that is. So I think the Europeans should think a bit more about the strategic benefit. What is it that they're actually providing? Because at the moment, they're talking about geopolitical Europe. For me, I translate this into, essentially doing great power politics. That is, we're locked in another battle with another Nazi Germany, which is Russia this time, apparently. But this is not a good unifying issue because, the war in Ukraine is going to be over. And then what? I don't see that. I don't think the threat from the Russians is genuine. I think this is a conflict which we helped to trigger to a large extent. The idea that the Russians will invade all of Europe, such as we could have been concerned about during the Cold War, it's not real. And also, as we engage in this geopolitical rivalry with the Russians, we cut ourselves off from key economic resources, and we make ourselves excessive, and we create security conflicts, which makes us excessively dependent on the United States. So what do the United States do when we're this dependent? They say, oh, well, cut yourself off from the Chinese technologies, cut yourself off from the Russian energy. Well, maybe we'll blow up Nord Stream, and now we're completely dependent on the US. They know how to convert this security dependence into geoeconomic and political loyalties. And you see this now. They can put any horrible trade deals in front of the EU, and they will sign it out of necessity. So I think we should be essentially doing the opposite. And that's what you see other countries around the world is doing. When the world is becoming multipolar, you don't wed yourself to one side, because if you wed yourself only to the US, you have less prosperity. And even the one you call an ally will be in a position to take advantage. And I think that's what the US will do. They will cannibalize their industries. They will use security dependence to extract the concessions. We should do the exact opposite. We should, if you look at energy security, for example, how foolish, what are we doing? In energy security, you want cheap and reliable supply of energy. Then you diversify, you get many suppliers. Don't be too dependent on the Russians, but don't be too dependent on Americans. Get the agreements with everyone. But that's not what the Europeans are saying. We're saying we're going to cut ourselves off from everyone now, except the Americans. And now the Americans can charge us whatever they want, if they even have energy to supply. This is not how states behave in a multipolar world. This is, look to Turkey, for example. What are they doing? We keep saying, are they allied with us or the Chinese or the Russians? No, they want to be an independent pole of power. Then you have to have a good relation with all the other centers of power. Once you wed yourself to one, you lose everyone, essentially. So I think we've been doing exactly the opposite of what we should. And I think that these efforts to link ourselves solely to the United States and hoping that they will take us back to the 90s and the Americans will reward our political obedience, it's a misunderstanding. The Russians did this in the 90s, by the way. They, under Yeltsin, they thought, we want to be part of a greater European home. And they, in the rush to the West, they even threw away, they ignored China, Central Asia, and all their traditional partnerships. And they put all their eggs in the Western basket. And they were weak, and they had no other partners. And this is what the Americans said very open. We're the only game in town. what are they going to do? The worst possible option we put on the table is the best option they have. And so this is not what you do. You diversify. That's how you will prosper. And the Europeans aren't doing this. If they did, then I think there would be hope, but they're not. So I'm pessimistic.
No, it's a compelling set of arguments, certainly. I mean, from the time that I visited Russia, I lived there briefly. My father left to move to London to be with my mother because they met in Moscow in 1981. It was only because of the collapse of the bipolar order and the Cold War that I came to be honest with you. So being a mixture of English Russian is always a bit of an identity crisis. I'm always searching for my inner feeling. Now you speak to John Mearsheimer a lot, and I met him once and I asked him quite a simple question back when I was based in DC, and it was simply, what would bring the United States and Russia closer together? And he obviously gave typical Mearsheimer answer of the rise of China. But with the situation we're seeing now, with Trump seemingly taking a sledgehammer to everything, it kind of brings me back to what you said about diversification, because in my mind, Europe is exploring that, perhaps not very effectively, but because they're looking at developing economic trade deals. You mentioned about their perhaps a stronger hand in geopolitics. Trump's really doesn't like that, because diversification shows a lack of control or a lack of influence over the direction of Europe as a continent. So how do you see this playing out if Trump can't force the hand of Europe or others to support him in Hormuz, for example, to bring it back to Iran? How do you think that will trigger Trump's next play, if he has one?
Well, I don't think he has one, and I think this is one of my concerns. I think there's going to be a bit of a meltdown once all the power begins to slip away, because he doesn't have that many options. I mean, he treats the Europeans with such contempt. I mean, he keeps talking about annexing Greenland, so we're going to take your territory. He shows contempt for the Europeans, and then he expects them to enter the war against Iran when he calls on them. And the irony is, I think that the Europeans might have actually joined the war on Iran because they are desperate to essentially increase their stock value in Washington to be seen as important allies. But he didn't even tell them he was going to invade Iran. He waited until the war was going so poorly, and then he said, "Oh, can you come and join?" I think it was I forgot who said it. It might have been a French general. Someone said that we're being invited to the Titanic after it hit the iceberg. I mean, I thought that was a good point, because if we would have been invited before they hit the iceberg, we would probably have joined, I think, because we're desperate to seek the Americans, to be seen as important allies, because so much we bet on the Americans. So, no, so I'm sorry, I forgot the question, but
no, simply what is Trump's calculus here, if he has one? Because in my opinion, Europe is trying to diversify. Trump's obviously now threatening NATO. I wanted to ask you about a question on that in a moment. But simply because he didn't seek consultations, he didn't even let us know that he was planning this war. There's no legal basis by which that we have to get involved, but you seem pretty set that Europe is going to be involved in some way, or some countries will do something. And will that tip the balance of power in some way?
No, sometimes Trump is full of bluster, but I don't think it's all madness behind it. I mean, I every now and then I talk on my podcast with George Beebe, who's the former CIA director for Russia analysis, and I thought he outlined nicely the logic behind it, and he was making the point that we, in a multipolar world when our competitiveness is weakening, that is the American, they need allies as force amplifiers, that is, who can bring something to the table. And the Europeans are seen essentially as an expense. It's exhaust a lot of American resources. And also look at it like this: if it is a multipolar world, what you don't want to do is tie up all the resources in Europe, which can't really add much to your force. They're not a force amplifier. Making matters worse, not only does Europe consume a lot of American resources and focus, but it also, by being in Europe, it pushes the Russians closer to the Chinese. So it's horrible on many levels. So If anything, in this great power rivalry, you want to bring the Russians over to our side of the ledger. Now, I don't think that's realistic, but all we have to do is not piss off the Russians, essentially. That is because it's in Russia's interest to diversify, because China is a much more powerful actor, at least economically, than the Russians. So, and that's okay for the Russians. As long as they diversify, it doesn't matter. If they put all their eggs in the Chinese basket, that's problematic because it's asymmetrical interdependence. They will be more dependent on China than China is on Russia. This is okay if they diversify. So ideally, the Russians would want to deal with China, but also have India, the Europeans, the Americans. So they naturally want to diversify, but they can't because being dependent on the United States and Europe is very dangerous at this point in time. So they can't. But if the U.S. can improve relations with the U.S. with Russia, well, why wouldn't they? What do they really have today that makes them opposing powers? The US is worried that a new multipolar system is being developed in opposition to the United States. Russia doesn't really need this. They don't have this. That's, by the way, a commonality with the British, something that, in 200 years ago, you had people like John Stuart Mill writing, why exactly are we so hostile to the Russians? At times we have competing interests, but our conflicts, the rivalry and the hatred and Russophobia doesn't really make much sense. It goes way over the top, and I think the same applies to the U.S. today. What is it exactly that where the competing interests between the U.S. and Russia? I don't think there are that many, to be honest. I think most of them have come from the division of Europe. That is, you had some of it with communism, obviously, and then after World War II, when the Soviet Union essentially shattered the balance of power in Europe by being too powerful. But otherwise, there's no reason why they can overcome this. And you can say, yeah, well, that's a power aspect. You can say, well, what about values and all? Well, I think after the Cold War in the West, when we redivided the continent, we also created new ideological dividing lines. We said, everything is between liberal democracies and authoritarians. We, the in-groups, are liberal democracies, the out-groups are authoritarians. Well, Trump and his ilk, but you can also put many of the new American conservatives into this category, the ones that view empire as something that brings down the republic. It doesn't make them safer or more prosperous. They don't. They tend to see the world a bit like Samuel Huntington. It's not liberal democracy versus authoritarianism. It's a cosmopolitanism versus nationalism, and they essentially see the Germany and the EU as being this woke over liberal, and the Russians are more traditional, Christian European tradition. So essentially, from their division, Russia goes from being the ultimate outgroup to one of us, I think. So the power distribution and the ideology, everything switches. And I think that they're seen as a fellow conservative country in many ways. And if you listen to the likes of Tucker Carlson's, for example, I think this comes through quite clearly. That is why we allied with the Germans. What are they doing for us? And what are their core beliefs? What exactly is wrong with the Russians today? I tend to agree with this. I don't understand why the Russians are. I think that the curse for Europe is the dividing lines we kept in Europe after the Cold War. I think this is a mistake. We could have shed this very easily. All the reasons we say we can't make friends with the Russians today is essentially the symptoms that we divided the continent.
I think that there's certainly a particular animosity towards Moscow in the Anglo-Saxon states, or specifically Britain and America. You see that a lot more evident in policy making in Whitehall, in DC. I think probably because of what they were the crux, the underlying pinning of intelligence, and that's sort of the security architecture of the post-World War II order. It's less prevalent on the continent. I mean, the Italians, the French, depending upon the Greeks, quite a lot of countries have a certain sympathy for Russia, or that there was perhaps an unnecessary antagonization through the expansion of NATO. Now, I would love to dive into that with you more, perhaps in a later conversation. But again, in keeping it with sort of more contemporary events, the threat of leaving NATO by Trump is obviously not possible unless he gets Congress's approval. But there's this concept of NATO minus, that sort of NATO can somehow operate without the United States. Some people argue bringing in Ukraine because they've got a lot of military experience against Moscow, against the Russian military in Ukraine. Like, can something like that, in your opinion, function, or you think it's that's not a point to be arguing? It should be about not being so antagonistic with Moscow.
Sorry, I didn't get the question.
Well, do you think that a NATO without the United States could work?
No, probably. I think NATO is the United States. Essentially, it's too US led. There could become something in place, of course, but it's hard to see it working, both in terms of the power, but also the purpose. Once we had the Cold War Europe divided, you had the post Cold War collective hegemony. It was clear that the Russians were on the outside, we're on the inside. I don't understand. I don't see how it would be held together. What exactly would be the strategic mission here? It doesn't make much sense. I think there would be too high of a cost to perpetuate this anti-Russian campaign, and there's nothing in it for us. I mean, unless people think that the Russians are actually going to start marching across Ukraine and go and take Poland and aim for Berlin, unless they think this is what's in the Russian mind, I don't see what the point would be. I think we have to make up an enemy in order to have internal solidarity, and the whole construct will just make us weaker, will cut us off from an important partner. It will exhaust our resources, and they will create too much internal divisions. I don't think it's a sustainable strategic platform to seek unity.
But how possible do you think it is to bring a sort of an improved relationship, right? Pretend I'm talking from the position of Brussels, right? How do you see us normalizing or reestablishing ties with Moscow with Putin still at the helm? A lot of people don't think it's possible until there's at least, maybe not an entirely new system in Russia, but at least someone different who shows a different mindset, a different approach to foreign policy. Or you don't think it matters?
No, I think we should do it while Putin is there. I think whoever will follow Putin will not care for it very much. If anything, the way he's seen in Russia is that it's always being too weak and lenient on the West, especially in the Ukraine war now. The fact that he didn't take the approach of the Iranians to go up the escalation ladder and maintain Russia's deterrence, that he essentially allowed the Westerners to simply send more weapons, strike some Russian cities, and just not go up the escalation ladder, not seeking to deter. So I think I just don't see what exactly with Putin's mindset. I think, if anything, look at the Americans under Biden. It started to look like we're moving towards an actual direct war at the end of the Biden administration, when they were sending the ATACMS attacking Russia with them, which is essentially an American direct attack on Russia. As soon as Trump had some warm words, let's try to get along. The Russians are nothing if not pragmatic, and they said, oh, well, this is a guy we can work with. And suddenly, America went from being the number one enemy, and now they look towards Germany and maybe Britain. So, yeah, so I think you can make peace with the Russians. So I think, I'm not sure. I think we demonized Putin a bit too much. I think it was Kissinger who wrote something along the line that the demonization of Putin is a strategy, is an excuse for not having one. And Putin, I think, is predictable. He will act in Russia's interest. You can trust him to the extent that trusting him in pursuing what is considered to be Russian interests. And I don't think. We don't have to like Putin. It doesn't really matter. But he represents Russian interests, and if we look at we can't deal with him because of the invasion of Ukraine. I think any other Russian leaders would probably have done the same, and they would have might have been more aggressive as well. This is seen as an existential threat, and they responded to it. I mean, If the Russians would have done something similar in Mexico, toppled the government there, began to move in missiles and building, secret bases along the American borders, I don't think it matters who would be in the White House. So my advice to the Europeans would, you don't have to wait for anyone. The best thing to do, at least pick up the phone. Why aren't we even talking to the Russians? This is crazy to me, though. 4 years into this war. Why?
Isn't Macron suggesting that? We've had European leaders suggesting to talk to Putin.
Yeah, suggesting. Yeah, we're discussing whether or not we should talk to Putin, and then if we should talk to the Russians, who should speak on our behalf. And then once all of this is settled, we can discuss what our terms are and what we want to achieve, how to achieve it. But it just seems we boycotted diplomacy for years now. And what exactly did this achieve? I see politicians in this country as well. They refer to it as if it would be the most virtuous thing. They sat on the sidelines and watched hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians and Russians die in the trenches, and they refused to even talk to the opponent to look for possibilities of putting an end to this and at least reducing some of the harshest aspects of this war. And they frame this as being this moral achievement, like, oh, we don't talk to him, we don't legitimize him. I mean, it's quite absurd. But I think that's also a curse or a relic of the unipolar moment, because during the Cold War we spoke to the Russians, we showed them a little bit of respect. In the post-Cold War era, what is diplomacy then? Traditionally, if you have many centers of power, how do you create security? Is you seek to reduce the security competition. Well, how do you do this? Well, you assess the security concerns of your adversary. You have some empathy. You engage in diplomacy. Find out how do you manage cooperation and competition. Where can you find a compromise? In a unipolar moment, you don't do this. Your goal isn't to enhance your security by reducing the security competition. No, your goal is the exact opposite. You want to be so dominant that your adversaries can't even aspire to even collectively balance you. So this is essentially the approach we have towards the Russians and anyone else. That is, we don't have to assess their concerns. We don't have to put ourselves in their shoes. And essentially the language is ultimatums and threats. And, I always make the point, when was the last time we heard our politicians or journalists discuss what are the Chinese security concerns, what are the Russian security concerns, or the Iranians? We don't do this. We just explain to our people that there's good guys in the world, there's bad guys in the world, and peace is created when the good guy defeat the bad guy. It's this is I think a product of the hegemonic order.
Very interesting, Glenn. This is why I've been very looking forward to bringing you on for such a while. No, I mean, I'm a great power competition, order, focus, grand strategy guy. I guess my last question for you, because you've been very generous with your time, is simply, where do you see this going? Now, we talked about Iran initially, and now we've kind of shifted a little bit more to Eurocentric discussions and Russia. So I'll let you answer the question as you wish, but just one little tidbit I'd like your thoughts on as well, which is, there's the argument that, yes, you have multipolarity, but because it's inherently unstable, over time it will somewhat gravitate towards bipolar again. In this case, the United States and China, with Trump throwing up so much of a destruction to the transatlantic relationship. Is that even a case now, or are we just going to live in a perpetual state of instability around the world?
Well, I don't necessarily think that the bipolar is more stable than multipolar, because in a bipolar, everything becomes extremely zero-sum, as it was during the Cold War, where you would have logic such as, if we do a first strike on them, we can knock them out and we only lose 20% of our population. That's a victory for us, Do you get this kind of really extreme zero-sum thinking? In a multipolar world, if you have a country A weakening country B, then country C can come out on top. And this is I think it can often be more restrained. But I think it's also in the interest of the United States to make sure that it doesn't become simply bipolar, because traditionally the U.S. strength has come from being an offshore balancer. That is, it enters world wars after the main countries in Europe or Eurasia has exhausted themselves and both blood and treasury, and they just seek to come in at the end and make sure that there's a balance of power, that there's an equilibrium, that they balance each other, and then you pull back. The whole idea is if the US would stay too long in Europe or Eurasia, then the regional powers will begin to collectively balance the US. The US would exhaust its resources. And so this is why essentially the British as well, they did this, has also done this. Just keep that continent balancing each other. So I think this is what the Americans should aim for. But instead, they often behave as if it's still a unipolar moment, because in a unipolar moment, you want to be everywhere at the same time. You want to prevent the rise of any rivals. Well, what does that mean? Well, you had people like Hillary Clinton arguing in 2012, the Russians are trying to re-Sovietize Central Asia, restore the Soviet Union. And she was referring to the Eurasian Economic Union. And she said we should sabotage or roll it back. And, Ukraine was the main piece, because if you take Ukraine out of it, it looks too much power concentrated in Moscow, so people would be more cautious. Well, if you sabotage the Eurasian Economic Union, which institutionalizes Russian influence in Central Asia, then that whole region will drift too heavily towards China in terms of economic influence. Well, you can tell the Indians stop trading with the Iranians. Okay, well then the Iranians will become excessively dependent on China. This is also the idea, the traditional British-American approach of cutting off the Germans from the Russians. Yes, it would have been great in the 19th and 20th century, but in this century, we're just pushing Russia all the way to China. So all of these things is simply strengthening the Chinese center of power, which creates a more unfavorable bipolar distribution of power for the United States. It also makes it more zero-sum. So I think that the Americans actually have an interest in creating a multipolar distribution of power. But I think this transition from the unipolar to the multipolar is going to be a very dangerous and difficult thing.
To be devil's advocate, Glenn, as a final question, I know I said last time before, but I'll be cheeky. This is a signature part of the show. No, but simply, America has 800 bases. China has 2. America does have still what remains of an alliance network, at least we think. China doesn't have that, really. It has a couple of defense pacts and a close relationship with Pakistan. The Russians, the Chinese have limited relations, especially over the Arctic. There's going to be pressure. So, of course, America can be undermined, but can we really see a new hegemon appear? Or it is very much about centers of power, the one in Asia led by China, the one by America and West, Russia and Europe as a sort of broader thing. Is that how you see the sort of the spheres of influence being spread in the coming years?
Well, I think in a multipolar system, there's a natural mechanisms in place for rejecting another hegemon to emerge. Like, the closest best partner the Chinese have is Russia. The Russians don't want a Chinese hegemony. This is why they're also making sure that they diversify, that they reach out to these other centers of powers. This is why they want the Indians in the Arctic, for example. You don't want excessive dependence on China, which is why I'm saying this is in interest of the United States as well, to make sure that there's an equilibrium in Eurasia. So. No, but regarding America's power, this is why I tend to be very sympathetic towards this new, breed of Americans who are now contesting essentially that consensus in the 90s, that is of the hegemonic peace. Because if you remember back in the 90s when they embraced this unipolar moment or the hegemonic peace, I thought it was based on some, you can say altruistic arguments. That is, under a hegemon, there won't be any international anarchy. That is, there won't be any competition between great powers because there will only be one. So this would essentially create some stability, but also because it's the United States, which is a liberal democracy, it could elevate the role of liberal democratic values, create more peaceful world. So you had the argument there, but I always belong to the critics, which said something different. They said this is going to be temporary. Unipolarity has to be a temporary phenomenon because it depends on preventing the rise of other great powers. Over time, what's going to happen? The US will exhaust its resources, economically, social, political, and also it will incentivize the other great powers in the international system to collectively balance the US. Now look at all the power the US had in the 90s, the immense concentration of power, and look where they are today. In the 90s, the Chinese, the Russians, their main foreign policy was let's try to get as close as possible with the Americans. Today, you have BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, many others now, from Indonesia to Iran. Yeah, it's not necessarily working that well, but the logic behind it is we have to balance off the United States. You have the world balancing the US, and meanwhile, the US is now, what, $39 trillion in debt. They're having massive social problems, political polarization. They have a lot of problems. So when you have this new breed of American, especially conservatives, coming out saying that the empire is killing the republic, let's scale back the empire. I think this is out of they recognize that this is not sustainable. The Chinese are now climbing the global value chains. They probably will win this AI race. And what's going to happen in the next economic crisis of the United States? I think a lot of this basis, while it may look like strength, it becomes a vulnerability at some point, and I think that point is coming very soon. So I don't know. I don't want to see the U.S. sink into the ocean. I think it would be better to not have them as an exhausted, overextended empire that faces like a Soviet-style collapse. I think it would be better for them and the world to see them instead retract a bit to a more modest position as one among many centers of powers. And I think that's the best they can hope for. But nobody wants to live under a Chinese hegemony, by the way. And I don't see the Chinese. No, but the Russians would then balance it. This is the whole thing. If America tomorrow has a massive economic collapse and the Chinese begin to embrace ideologies of global dominance, the Russians will probably lean themselves more towards the U.S. and it would have a natural balancing. So I don't think I think the global hegemon of the United States. I think this is the only time we will see this. I don't see this happening again.
Very, very compelling set of arguments, as I said before, Glenn. Very, very interesting to hear your takes. And I know everyone watching, Glenn Diesen, professor at the what university? Southern Norway, isn't it? That's right.
University of Southeastern Norway.
Southeastern Norway. Okay, we been skiing in southwest Norway, but I haven't been to southeast Norway yet. So anyway, but yeah, thank you so much for your time, Glenn. It's been an absolute pleasure. Everyone watching, do subscribe and check out Glenn's work if you don't already, and we'll see you very soon. Got another stream with Larry Johnson in just a couple of hours, but take care, everyone. See you soon.